So I'd like to invite my guests up. I've got John Thornhill, who's Innovation Editor from Financial Times. John. We've got Lord Clement Jones, who is basically kind of chair of everything as related to AI. We've got Sue Daly, who is chief spinner of plates at techUK. It is. We've got Simon McDougall, who's joining us from ICO, and we've got Heather Patterson, who is joining us from Intel, who also very kindly sponsored today. Now, just the focus of this session is really kind of digital ethics, solution or sideshow, and clearly there is quite rightly skepticism out there about the debate around ethics, about whether it can be meaningful, whether it has any real direct impact. And what we actually asked John to do is to kick us off with a bit of a kind of provocation in terms of how, as a journalist, looking at the landscape around innovation, about really how John sees the world around kind of digital ethics. So, John, if you'd like to kick us off.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to talk this morning. So, digital ethics, solution or sideshow? I think if talking about ethics could solve the problem, then we would have already solved everything by now. Rarely does a day pass without me, and I suspect a lot of you in the audience, being invited to one tech conference or another somewhere in the world with a panel on ethics. To be clear, I think this is a great thing. These debates are worth having. And I remember Martha Lane Fox spoke in this room a couple of years ago where she made a very powerful case for responsible tech. Unless we are careful, we are in danger of entrenching rigid old hierarchies of power in digital form. And her organization, .Everyone, has done great work, I think, in challenging a lot of these assumptions. techUK itself has been very active in this debate, publishing, I think, your report in February with your 8 principles. The all-party parliamentary group on AI, also represented on this panel, has done a good job of discussing many of the most pressing issues, as well as the ICO. We've heard from Elizabeth Denham, and we will hear from Simon. And as a result of all of this collective effort, the ethics debate has really become mainstream, I think. I'm delighted that it's a sign of the times that Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, won the FT McKinsey Business Book of the Year award just this week. And Caroline Criado Perez did a brilliant job, I think, in that book of dissecting the male default society and urging better representation in key design decisions. So much of this good debate, I think, is good, important, and necessary, but my provocation is that it is not sufficient. We have to move from words to actions if the tech industry is to retain credibility and trust. So the first question I'd like to pose is this. When we talk about ethics, whose ethics do we mean? Who gets to define them? Cathy O'Neill has written, "Algorithms are opinions embedded in code, but whose opinions should we listen to?" The tech industry, whether it likes it or not, is in the values uploading business. Whose values are we going to upload? Harvard's Berkman Klein Internet Institute has identified 32 sets of AI principles that have been published by various companies, institutes, governments, and international agencies. There's quite a lot of convergence in these reports, but they all have different points of view. And a Chinese scholar I met recently thought there were actually 50 sets of principles around the world. And the Nuffield Foundation and the Ada Lovelace Institute hosted a fascinating debate recently where they had 3 Chinese scholars coming to talk about how they viewed technology. And they were arguing that there wasn't even one single set of Chinese values. There was a Buddhist, there was a Confucian, a communist set of values. And Kai-Fu Lee, the author of AI Superpowers, has even called the Chinese approach techno-utilitarianism. Tech should be used to help engineer the greatest good for the greatest number of people. But that approach, I think, risks running directly counter to the Western approach with its emphasis on individual rights and privacy. And we see this very clearly in the recent story we had in the FT about how Chinese companies are lobbying for new international standards in the UN's International Telecommunication Union for facial recognition, video monitoring, and city and vehicle surveillance. We quoted one expert saying, "There are virtually no human rights, consumer protection or data protection experts present in ITU standards meetings, so many of the technologies that threaten privacy and freedom of expression remained unchallenged in these spaces." And closer to home, as we've already heard, we've had this row erupt about the debate of use of facial recognition at King's Cross. The debate has already begun in Europe about how we preserve our digital sovereignty, but when it comes to the values uploading business, what voice do the digitally unconnected have? Are we going to set the rules before half the world's population comes online? The second big point I'd like to make is that ethics debate, it seems to me, is relatively safe space for many of the tech companies, because it keeps discussion in an area that does not really threaten their business interests. In that sense, the ethics debate is only a small part of a far bigger story. I think big tech is challenging and disrupting many of the traditional functions of government and rewriting the rules of capitalism, as Shoshana Zuboff has written in her book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. Facebook is already better at verifying identity than any government agency. Facebook plays a bigger role in controlling and, in some cases, censoring information flows, and it is now launching its own currency. That may sound scary, but there is an argument that in many respects, this challenge to government could be a very good thing. Maybe tech companies can help deliver better, cheaper, faster services than government. Healthcare may yet emerge as a classic example. I personally think that tech can deliver enormous improvements in healthcare, enabling us to focus on the 3 Ps of prevention, precision, and personalization. But as we have seen in the UK with the disputes with DeepMind and now Amazon, that is only going to work if the public have trust in the integrity of their personal data and do not believe that the private companies are profiting unfairly from what are common goods. And that implies smarter data governance and regulation. And in particular, I was struck by point 7 of techUK's 8 principles, which is to ensure regulators have the capability and capacity needed to consider ethics. And as citizens, I think we all clearly do not want the tech industry to capture regulators, but we do want the tech industry to inform regulation so that it is not bad, blind, or self-defeating. Traditionally, I think the tech industry has floated 2 objections to regulation. The first has been, it is too early to do anything. It is still a young industry, it's in the process of evolving, and we do not want to stifle innovation. And the second argument is, it is too late to do anything. People are already dependent on these services, and you cannot do anything about it. But the tech industry, I think, does appear to be changing its tune on this front, which I think is a very welcome development. And I recently heard one top tech executive argue why smart regulation would benefit the tech industry. Cars can travel faster and go around corners more safely when they are fitted with brakes. So we need to start translating some of these more abstract and ethereal principles about ethics into crunchier rules and regulations. We need to start fitting some brakes. Critically, we need to decide what regulations need updating or even scrapping, and in what fields. And the first step, I think, should always be the rigorous enforcement of existing laws, which hasn't always been the case. And I'm thinking notably of privacy law, competition law, taxation law. A lot of tech companies, or really some tech companies, pay more in fines than in taxes. Flouting the law is part of their business model, and that cannot possibly be right. Where necessary, though, we may need to update legislation or introduce completely new legislation. To list some possible examples of where that might be necessary, I'm thinking about areas like deep fakes or self-driving cars or facial recognition or the use of drones. So, in conclusion, I would argue that ethics are both a solution and a sideshow. I think that's a very political answer, and maybe I should be standing in tomorrow's election. But ethics is undoubtedly a very important solution to part of the problem, but it is also something of a sideshow in the far bigger game that is being played out between tech companies, government, and society about how we shape our collective future.
Brilliant. John, thank you very much. Gosh, a huge amount to get into there. Tim, you've worked on, as I was saying, on so many of the really important reports that have come out from the House of Lords. You're working with the Institute for Ethical AI in Education and so on. What is your sense of are we making progress from principles to action?
Well, I'm a bit curate's egg, just like John, because I think he's introduced the subject extremely well. But I do think, first of all, that we need to understand that actually, that in the last 18 months, we've been building some UK institutions that actually are fit for purpose. Now, it may sound strange to say that a day before a general election, but honestly, when you look at some of the progress we've made, I do just want to stop for a second and say, well, look, we've got an Office for AI, which has done some very good things. We've adopted the WEF guidelines on procurement for algorithms in the public sector, and they've done a number of other things, including working with the G20 on the ethical principles that the digital ministers adopted. We've got the CDEI, which has looked at some very interesting areas, the bias, micro-targeting, some of their snapshots in terms of deep fakes and so on. We've had the Turing working with the ICO, with people like Simon, on the Project Explain. We've had the AI Council now formed, a little bit embryonic. We've even had the Furman report commissioned by, lo and behold, the Treasury in terms of looking at things like data monopoly and so on. So we do have the makings of some institutions that can actually deal with some of these issues. And then on the international area, we've had people like the OECD, the EU, trying to operationalize or suggest ways of operationalizing those principles. I think, but I do agree with John, that what we now need to do is to look much more carefully at some of the compliance mechanisms. In government, there's very little in terms of compliance mechanisms, for instance, on things like algorithmic decision-making, the whole area. I mean, I've got a private members bill coming down the track in terms of automated facial recognition technology, which is absolutely crying out for A, a moratorium, and B, regulation after we've had time to really think about it. And then for me, a really important area, and not just simply for tech companies, is the whole area of corporate governance. We've talked endlessly about the Sustainable Development Goals, but I genuinely believe that AI can help develop, solve some of those SDG issues. And that means we have to have what, in the jargon is called the purposeful company, and we really need to rethink the whole area of corporate governance. And we saw a report that came out from the British Academy last week. There's a whole mass of stuff coming out in that area, which in a way is the operationalizing of those digital ethics. And I think if you marry those things, then I think we stand a chance of being able to make sure that we do get our arms around this issue.
So, thank you. So then let's turn to the kind of corporate representative on the panel, Heather. So, I mean, obviously, Intel plays a really fundamental role in the whole technology ecosystem. Absolutely underpins many technologies. How are these issues starting to permeate through your business and your organization, and what are the kind of changes that you've seen happening over the last couple of years in terms of the way in which you're responding as a business?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll start by saying that I occupy a really fantastic space at Intel. I am a senior research scientist, but I'm a social scientist. And so I work with a number of anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, policy experts, lawyers, and engineers to sit down and really go into communities to assess the real-life, real-world impact that artificial intelligence systems are having on communities, not just the benefits that they're bringing, but the dangers that they pose, and then bringing those insights back to our policy team and our product teams. What I've seen over the past 18 months, especially the last 12 months, is shifting the perspective from the principles that we need to be establishing for ourselves to set the tone from the top within an organization, shifting that to a how. How do we actually build in principles of diversity, of accessibility, privacy, security, safety, and so on into the tools that we build? At Intel, this is a really complex process because we create hardware, software, we make AI capabilities. In some cases, we create entire end-to-end solutions. And so when you're thinking about how do we operationalize these principles and bring them to life, you're looking at inserting checkpoints into a product development lifecycle, starting from the very beginning when you're first evaluating a use case. Maybe you're working with a customer and you have to ask, is this something that is going to be socially beneficial? What are the downsides of this and for society? And do those downsides outweigh the benefits? And then from there, work with engineers at each step of the process of the product development lifecycle to ask particular ethical questions. So in most cases, corporations, businesses already have processes in place for privacy compliance, for safety, for security. What we've been able to do is leverage those existing processes, and where we can, build in ethical questions about bias and transparency and accountability, explainability, and so on, moving beyond compliance to how should things be? What should the world look like? And we're seeing really great success with that. You know, these are early days, I think, for all corporations who are holding themselves more accountable and you know, moving toward this new world. But generally, I'm seeing a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm, not only from top-line leadership, and this is not just at Intel, but at other corporations, but seeing a lot of passion within the organizations themselves. So educating the engineers and the business leaders and the user experience professionals and the designers. A lot of people want to be part of this conversation right now.
So let's move on to the regulatory kind of perspective. And obviously we heard from Elizabeth in terms of some of the big questions that she's seeing emerging in this kind of the knitting together of world of ethics and the world of kind of hard law and regulation. But Simon, I mean, tell us a little bit about the journey that the ICO's been on over the last couple of years, and also and where you think the ICO goes next in terms of the you know, your actual work in these areas.
Well, when I think about that journey, then I actually started my own personal journey because this conference is very dear to me. I got really interested in this area soon before this conference was first spun up 2 years ago, and then came here, and this was really sparked my interest in this as a discipline, as an emerging area. And so, in a way, I think this conference to me is like the rings of a tree that you chop down. You can see how the seasons have worked by where we are. This should be a benchmark, and we should challenge ourselves every year when we're here to what progress we've made. And I would completely agree with Tim that we have made a lot of progress in the 2 years since the inaugural conference, and we should be very pleased with that. And we've worked very hard at the ICO to understand where our place is in that firmament. So Elizabeth said in her words that we're very keen to be an active part of this discussion, but we're not looking as a data protection regulator to necessarily be leading the discussion because there are very large areas of overlap, and the majority of use cases we've seen involve personal data and have questions there. So we've got to be very active in it. But even in Phil's piece, where he's speaking, say, around the small-scale mining and the use of satellite imagery, or Anthony, your point around carbon, there obviously are there are many other points where data is being used where personal data isn't necessarily involved and privacy isn't necessarily involved. So we have to kind of work that out, because I think virtually every other point we've made in the last few speeches have involved personal data. It's been facial recognition technology, or councils making decisions on putting people into care, or police forces on where they target resources, and these are all involving people and humans and affecting humans. So we're still feeling a way around that, and it's part of Ellis's role coming in as our data ethics advisor is not to create a massive ethics bridgehead at the ICO. It's to think thoughtfully about where we, what our position is and where our resources are, so we're contributing positively to the debate. In terms of where we've come in these 2 years, I'm reminded of that thing you often see on T-shirts and mugs where someone says, if you're still smiling, you don't appreciate the scale of the problem. I think what's becoming clear is quite how much this ethics discussion is incredibly broad and is multi-point. And even in the points we've had today, we've gone everything from, as I said, like satellites floating over the Earth, kind of photographing vast swathes of rainforest, through to how we affect an individual engineer who's sitting there trying to work out, which bit of code to write or which bit of code to take off GitHub and drop in somewhere. That's an incredible scale of stuff. And we're talking about all the value that humans around the world find important. Again, the breadth and the depth of that is crazy. And I do wonder if over time, not yet, I still think there's a place for more ethics conferences and more ethics discussion, but we will perhaps evolve ourselves out of this as a discussion and realise that we're talking about many different things and they merit very different points, because otherwise we risk continuing having a circular conversation and boiling the ocean. But I do think we have made a lot of progress. I would say one thing that we have found in our experience so far as the ICO as to how far we've gone is, in a way, if you look at, say, the academics and the policy folk over here as a spectrum through to where the real world is, whilst these people are absolutely in the real world, we're having to already enforce on AI. We're still already having to investigate use of AI alongside everything else. It's not a pretty picture. There is dumb use of this technology, and some is dumb use of all technology, and facial recognition being an example where both in commercial and in government sectors there's lots of use of FRT which just seem to be unthinking. And so we shouldn't fool ourselves in this room. We are in the tip of an iceberg here, and we hear from, say, Microsoft or Intel talking about the things they're doing. These are good actors investing money in this, and with very, very sharp people who are talking very sensibly about this. But we're in a self-selecting group here. And we often find, as a regulator, where we get pulled into where things go wrong, that there's many other organizations out there who are less sophisticated and are not thinking through these points at all. So one of the big challenges I think we have going beyond where we are now, where I think progress has been made, to really making a change in the real world, is how do we get beyond just the organisations that have resources to put into this? I think we're winning that argument when we say the large tech firms. That is an important thing, and that is great and that is important. I don't want to belittle that at all. But how do we push on to the fact that the vast majority of activity in the UK is driven by small organisations and small businesses? How do we get to the fact that a lot of stuff is offshore in places that beyond the scope of some aspects of our regulatory frameworks, and yet services are being poured into the UK from it? How do we kind of expand out of our little bubble? Our bubble is important. The people in this room actually are genuinely influential for what happens in the UK in this area, but we need to keep challenging ourselves how we go beyond that into the real world.
Thank you. And we will be unashamedly using the real rings of a tree point in our marketing for this event this year. But let's Sue, let's pick up that point very directly. You're the person inside techUK who probably speaks to the widest group of techUK members around these issues. What's your view on that issue of how far is the awareness, the understanding, the skills, the capability, and the action percolating out? Through the membership and through the wider tech community?
Well, on election eve, I don't want to put too much on this, but like we had many years ago, it's not I agree with Nick, but I agree with Tim. So we have made a lot of progress, and there's a lot of work going on, right? There's a lot of things happening. And I think we are, and I'm starting to see the ethics conversation moving away from just the big boys and the big girls to those small organizations. And particularly around conversations around some of the guidance and some of the work that's come out. So thinking about the EU's AI trustworthy guidance principles, ethics principles. a big call from techUK members, and that we provided into the EU's consultation on that, is how can I use this as an SME? How applicable is this to me? And I know that's feedback we've given through the ICO's process of the explainable AI guidance. How can you make this real for an SME? So they're thinking about it. That's really positive. They're like, we want to do the right thing. We want to do this because we know it's important, because actually I think people are finding that customers are asking for this now as well. So we're seeing ethics questions being raised in RFPs more and more. So I think this is a conversation that the wider business community and the tech industry is having, but I agree that it's more needs to be done. You know, it's a safe space that we're here talking about it, but how do we get it into every organisation across the UK? I see it cropping up in more and more conversations in different techUK parts, actually, not just our part, but we had a circular economy conference a couple of weeks ago at techUK talking about carbon, talking about climate change. We had a great winnow who are developing and using AI and computer vision to help food waste in companies. And I was sitting there listening to this amazing tool being shown. And then this lady went, and we're looking at this from an ethical point of view about how people think and feel about this tool and how it's being used, and are they concerned that their data is being captured, or their, you know, how much they eat is being captured. They were thinking about it. No, it's being thought about. That to me is kind of like, I don't think we would have seen that 12 months ago. So I do see progress. I do see it happening. But there's more to be done in terms of getting the message out. But there's some really important work happening, and I do see it permeating down.
Sorry, Sue, one small point to build on that. I think one of the big transitions there with smaller organisations is the move from talking about this as a build conversation to a buy conversation. When we're talking with the large tech firms, very often, obviously, they're building their own stuff. That's what they do. And we often focus on that within the ethics discussion. With the majority of other organisations, it's about procurement and buying solutions and doing that in a thoughtful way and challenging whoever you're buying the stuff from. So I think that's one of the key shifts we have.
On a practical level, we are absolutely seeing kind of in RFPs and so on, these ethical questions kind of coming up. John, can I come back to you in terms of kind of the role of the media here? Because these are incredibly high-profile issues, incredibly high-profile companies. I talked earlier about the kind of skepticism around the word ethics. And it's clearly absolutely right that the media kind of holds the sector, that feeds the fire and so on, and make sure that there's the proper accountability. But it's also very easy for that to slip into a kind of cynicism around all of this, which if it goes too far, actually has the potential to kill off a lot of the energy and enthusiasm and action that we are seeing within the sector. So how do we navigate this kind of the public debate, and so that we keep on the right track of appropriate kind of scrutiny, but not falling into a sort of cynicism?
Oh, it's always a very dangerous place to try to defend the British media. I mean, I think the best of the British media has done a very good job of kind of holding at account some of the tech companies and exposing problems in society. Thinking of some of the work of my colleague Madhumita Murja, who's written on facial recognition technology and is writing about King's Cross and the ITU and so on. And I think that's a fantastic debate to have, and that's where journalism can play a very good role in airing these issues which people are not necessarily thinking about. But I take your point as well. I mean, I think there is a kind of reflexivity to a lot of the coverage of this. Whenever we talk about kind of robots, the first instinct is always to put a Terminator photograph in a newspaper or on a website, and to play up the kind of dystopian Black Mirror side of technology, which is not always very helpful. So I think there does clearly have to be a balance, but my view overall on kind of journalism is that it's an extraordinarily messy process, but it does do a lot of good in the end. You have a lot of bad journalism, you have a lot of good journalism, but that's a debate that has to be had. The whole spectrum of views have to be represented.
And so how should companies be thinking about that in terms of the way in which they engage in that public debate? What would you sort of say to them in a way in terms of, because there is nervousness?
Well, I mean, I think they should just be out in front explaining what they're doing. I mean, as Tim and Sue and others on the panel have been saying, companies are doing some very good things. I think the debate in the technology community itself is made a lot of progress. It's very healthy. but tech tends to be viewed in a bit of a vertical. There's a debate going on inside the tech industry itself, and I think what everyone here is talking about is it's now become a horizontal. This affects everybody. Every company, according to Satya Nadella, is an AI company. Every hospital trust has data that it has to take responsibility for. We all have to be part of this conversation, not just the tech industry.
So unfortunately, we've only got about 5 minutes left for this session because we've been catching up a little bit. So I'm going to ask a question to all of you, so to give you a chance to think about this. So this event always falls, at the end of the year, so it's a good opportunity to review the year that's gone by, but also a great opportunity to think about the year ahead. So my question to each of you really is, what do you want to see happen next year? What do you think the next important vital step is, either within your own organisation or within the wider kind of public debate? And who'd like to go first? Tim.
First of all, we need to be explicit about adopting one of those international ethical codes. We're all going to drive ourselves mad. There are more than whatever it is, 84, 100, heaven knows. We've got to choose the OECD or the EU set of principles and say, right, that's the overarching set, and within that have some sectoral guidelines, codes, etc., etc. Then we've got to think about the fact that the AI indeed affects every corporate company. It isn't just the tech companies, and we've got to try and build in, that purposeful use of AI and the ethical use of AI, whether you're a procurer or a developer. And that's got to be right across the code. And then as a politician, we have as politicians to understand where to regulate and where to keep our hands off, basically. And there are plenty of places that can keep us happy regulating, believe me, for quite a bit of time to come.
And do you have a personal favourite in terms of any of those international codes?
My personal, I think the EU code, because it actually tries to give some practical ways of operationalising the principles, is the best set so far.
Thank you.
But I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yes, you would. Heather, what would you like to see happen?
I would like us to work on aligning or resolving this tension that we're seeing between wanting to deploy AI technologies in a culturally sensitive, context-appropriate way into situations where local customs norms are respected, but at the same time have those deployments backstopped by international principles, ideally international human rights principles. And this comes into play in situations where you do have larger companies selling components to the smaller companies who may not have ethical impact assessment processes in place. Also selling to other governments that may use your technology in ways that you did not anticipate and you're deeply uncomfortable with. So Intel recently updated our human rights policy to clarify that we will not do business with companies that we find who are using our products to violate human rights. I would like us to, as a society, have a conversation where we figure out how to respect local norms while still honoring the rights of people everywhere to be treated with dignity and respect.
So mainstreaming this really through the supply chains with very much a kind of human rights focus in terms of end impact on people and societies. Yes. Simon.
Well, firstly, massively agree with both Heather and Tim and their points. I would love to see more really gritty, challenging conversations around actual payoffs and sacrifices that have to be made. It's very often, it's very easy to talk about ethics around, that we're all going to just be nice and there's a common good and we all kind of just will get along. It's the really hard things I hear is that there are payoffs. Now, at the ICO, we obviously are passionate about privacy, but we also accept that privacy is not an absolute right, and very often we're having to deal with challenging questions around different people's interests or the public interest and those kind of points. And you get to ethics, you have questions about societal good as well, and very often, there is real risk to individuals from any particular course of action you take, and there are some people going to do better or worse, etc., etc. Let's get to those gritty questions as we deal with, again, we keep using facial recognition as a very useful use case in many of these things. But that's a great example where there are absolutely massive questions around how we want our public spaces to work, but it's not just a matter that, you know, it's all good or it's all bad. So let's get to that point of saying, yeah, if we do it this way, then here are the pros, but here are the cons as well, and what do we do about that?
Yeah, I always remember somebody said, you know, if you haven't made some hard choices, you haven't made a strategy. And be hopefully plenty of space for gritty questions in the breakout sessions that follow this one. Sue, what do you like to say?
So I think we need to continue next year doing the hard work. Let's face it, we are now facing those gritty questions about what does this mean in reality, technically, what can we do, what does this mean at the coalface of reality. But I also want us, and I think we're going to talk about this a bit later, I also want us not to forget that we need to be looking a little bit ahead as well. So while we're doing the doing, and it's important work that Heather and others are doing, that we keep in mind we still need that ethical foresight. What might be coming next? What do we need to be just keeping an eye out while we're doing the doing? And I think I wouldn't want us to go too far one way and not forget about we also need to be thinking about foresight and what may be coming ahead and how do we prepare for that while we're doing the doing.
John, you kicked us off brilliantly. How would you like to?
I think the thing I would really like to see advance next year is the whole debate about data governance and having greater clarity about that. I think there's some amazingly interesting developments in that area, the whole privacy by design movement, the whole debate about data trusts. Data has tended to be, in many respects, it's an individual responsibility that we're supposed to be looking after our own data. I think we have to turn it into a collective responsibility. We don't expect, there's a fascinating debate at the Open Data Institute this year on this subject. We don't expect to look after our own clean water or clean air. We should have clean data. We should be able to use it in good ways that enable us all to benefit.
Thank you so much. It's always one of the great frustrations of this event that is we bring together such brilliant people and then we actually have so little time with them individually to talk through. But I would just like to thank you all, panel, for being fantastic and giving us a real great overview of the big question about whether this is a solution or a slideshow. I took plenty of positives from the conversation, but plenty of challenges as well. But if you'd like to join me in thanking the panel. So it now falls to me to explain the logistics for the next session because we're going to be after the coffee break breaking out into breakout sessions, and I very cleverly highlighted the instructions in my paper here in green, which means that I can't actually read what the instructions are. So there's going to be a session on fairness and transparency, which is in the Thames room. There's a session on inclusivity and diversity, which is in the Westminster room. And then a third session on ethics and tech for good, and that's in County. I think that's this room here, isn't it? I don't know how you get to choose, because I think every one of those sessions is going to be fascinating. We will then, that session will run, we'll then break for lunch. There'll be a further set of breakouts after lunch. And then we'll be bringing everybody back here, and we'll be doing a bit of an experiment in terms of, in every session, we've got somebody who is there to be a sort of barometer and to get the feel of the room. And then when we bring everybody back, we're going to ask those people to give their sense of the sort of the confidence or lack of confidence, positivity, nervousness that they felt in each of those discussions, to give you feedback on kind of what all those discussions felt like if you weren't in that room. No idea how it's actually going to work in practice, but we'll give it a go. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time and listening in this session. Please enjoy some coffee, enjoy the gritty discussions in the next breakouts, and see you later. Thanks a lot.